In exactly a few short years, something subtle but irreversible happens to your money, and most people won't notice it at first. There won't be sirens, emergency broadcasts, or dramatic announcements. There will be no headline that says your savings were just devalued. Instead, life will continue almost normally, except prices feel heavier, progress feels slower, and the money you worked years to store quietly loses its ability to protect you. This is the $26 trap, and has nothing to do with collapse and everything to do with survival, specifically the Federal Reserve's survival. Right now, most people believe devaluation only happens in weak countries, in failing systems, or in moments of obvious crisis. But history shows something very different. The most dangerous devaluations happen when a system is still functioning, when markets are still open, when paychecks are still coming in, and when people still trust their institutions. That is exactly the environment we are in today. The Federal Reserve is not preparing to destroy the dollar. It is preparing to preserve the system that depends on it. And the only way to do that, given the level of debt now embedded in the economy, is to quietly reduce the real value of what that debt represents, including your savings. The United States has crossed a threshold that changes the rules. More than $35 trillion in debt is no longer a political issue or a talking point. It is a structural condition. That debt must be serviced, rolled, refinanced, and sustained indefinitely. Paying it down is no longer an option. Defaulting on it would be catastrophic. So the only remaining path is dilution. Not a sudden wipeout, but a gradual reduction in purchasing power that makes the burden manageable over time. This is not theory. It is how every heavily indebted system has survived without collapsing outright. The Federal Reserve cannot say this out loud because saying it would break confidence. Instead, it acts through policy, incentives, language, and timing. Interest rates rise just enough to signal discipline, then pause just enough to prevent failure. Liquidity is tightened just enough to slow inflation, then loosened just enough to prevent recession. The goal is not price stability in the way people imagine. The goal is control, specifically controlling the rate at which purchasing power is lost so the system remains intact. This is where the trap forms. Savers are taught that patience is virtue, that holding cash is safety, that doing nothing is conservative. But in an environment where devaluation is policy, doing nothing is the most aggressive risk you can take. Because while your balance may not change, what it can buy does, and the loss compounds quietly, invisibly, year after year. Most people think inflation is the threat. Inflation is only the symptom. The real mechanism is currency debasement through necessity. When debt becomes too large to service honestly, it is serviced dishonestly, not through lies, but through math. Prices rise faster than wages. Assets inflate faster than savings. Time becomes the enemy of stored cash. And the system continues, not because it is healthy, but because it is adaptive. The year 2026 matters because it represents convergence. Debt rollover schedules, fiscal pressure, demographic strain, and monetary policy limits all compress into a narrow window. The Federal Reserve is running out of clean tools. Rate hikes break something. Rate cuts reignite inflation. Doing nothing allows debt servicing costs to explode. Every path leads to devaluation. The only choice left is how controlled it will be. This is why savings are the quiet casualty. Assets can reprice, businesses can adjust, governments can tax. But savings just sit there, obedient and exposed. And the system relies on that obedience. It relies on the fact that most people will not move, not question, not adapt, because everything still appears normal. The brilliance of this system is that it doesn't feel like theft. It feels like economics. Your money doesn't disappear. It just slowly stops working for you. And by the time that becomes obvious, years have passed. But here's the part. Most discussions miss. This is not the result of incompetence. It is the result of constraint. The Federal Reserve is not choosing devaluation because it wants to. It is choosing it because every alternative collapses the system faster. In that sense, devaluation is the least destructive option available. That doesn't make it harmless. It makes it inevitable. When people ask why the Fed can't simply fix the problem, they misunderstand the scale. You cannot fix a system built on decades of cheap debt without undoing the very growth it produced. You cannot remove leverage without destroying asset prices. You cannot protect savers without bankrupting debtors. Every lever pulled hurts someone. The Fed's job is to decide who absorbs the pain, and savers are the least organized, least vocal, and most compliant group available. This is why the first minute matters. Because once you understand that devaluation is policy, not accident, everything else changes. You stop waiting for a crash. You stop expecting a warning. You stop trusting stillness. And you start seeing signals instead of headlines. The signals are already here. Persistent inflation that refuses to return to old targets. Asset prices that rebound even when fundamentals weaken. Debt servicing costs that grow faster than revenue. Language that shifts from temporary to structural. These are not mistakes. They are adaptations. And this is where the dollar trap tightens. The more people sense risk, the more they hold cash. The more they hold cash, the more effective devaluation becomes. The system feeds on passivity. It survives by slowly transferring purchasing power from savers to debtors, from the future to the present, from stored value to circulating value. This is not a call to panic. Panic destroys clarity. This is a call to understanding, because understanding changes behavior, and behavior determines outcome. Most people will live through the 2026 shift without realizing it happened. They will blame prices, corporations, politics, or global events. Very few will trace the cause back to monetary necessity. Even fewer will act early enough to preserve purchasing power, not because the information wasn't available, but because it didn't feel urgent. But urgency does not always feel loud. Sometimes it feels calm, sometimes it feels like nothing at all, until it's everywhere. Stay with this, because once we move forward, the picture becomes clearer, the mechanics become visible, and the choices become obvious, not in hindsight, but in real time. Once you accept that devaluation is not a failure but a strategy, the behavior of the Federal Reserve starts to make sense. Interest rate policy stops looking contradictory. Inflation targets stop looking sincere. Communication becomes deliberately vague. This is not confusion. It is calibration. The Fed is trying to manage decline without triggering revolt, to spread pain without concentrating it, and to preserve trust long enough for the system to rebalance under new terms. This is why devaluation is never announced. It is experienced. It shows up in the shrinking distance between paychecks and bills, in the way assets feel increasingly out of reach, and in the realization that time is no longer neutral. Waiting costs you, holding costs you. Stability itself becomes expensive. The most important thing to understand is that this process does not require hyperinflation. In fact, hyperinflation would be a failure of control. What the Fed needs is moderate, persistent erosion, just enough to reduce the real value of debt over time while keeping the system recognizable. This is why inflation that settles at a higher baseline is more dangerous than a spike. Spikes are visible, baselines are accepted. Savings suffer most in this environment because they are static. They do not reprice upward automatically. They rely on nominal stability to preserve real value. When that stability is intentionally sacrificed, savings become the funding source for the transition, not directly, but mathematically. This is where people misunderstand fairness. They assume the system will protect prudence. But modern systems protect continuity. Prudence only matters if it aligns with system needs. Right now, the system needs spending, velocity, and participation. Hoarding value slows adaptation, so it is quietly penalized. The trap is psychological as much as financial. People wait for certainty before acting, but certainty only arrives after change is complete. By the time it feels safe to move, the advantage is gone. This is why the most useful skill in the next phase is not prediction, but recognition. Recognition of policy language, recognition of incentive shifts, recognition of what is being encouraged and what is being discouraged. When saving is punished and borrowing is normalized, the signal is clear. When assets inflate while wages lag, the signal is clear. When stability is promised but never delivered, the signal is clear. The Fed cannot reverse this without breaking something larger. It can only manage the pace. And the pace is accelerating because the margin for error is shrinking. Debt servicing costs rise with every rate increase. Political pressure limits austerity. Demographics reduce productivity growth. Global competition limits external absorption. Every lever is constrained. This is why 2026 is not about a single event. It is about a point where trends become unavoidable. The system shifts from managing perception to managing consequence, from smoothing cycles to locking in outcomes. The most dangerous mistake people make is assuming they will be told when the change is complete. They won't, because the system depends on continuity of belief. The moment belief collapses, control is lost. So belief is maintained through familiarity, through repetition, through the appearance of normality, and this is where beauty matters. Understanding this is not about fear, it's about clarity. There's a strange elegance in seeing the system for what it is, not malicious, not benevolent, but constrained, like gravity. It doesn't care what you believe. It only responds to structure. When you see that, panic disappears. You stop reacting emotionally and start responding intelligently. You stop waiting for permission. You stop assuming the future will resemble the past, just because it always has. The Federal Reserve is not your enemy, but it is not your protector either. It is the steward of a system whose needs may conflict with yours. And when that happens, the system always wins. The dollar will still exist after 2026. Banks will still operate, markets will still open, but the relationship between effort and reward, between saving and security, will be different. And those who adapted early will feel that difference as stability instead of loss. This is why this conversation matters now, not later. Not because something dramatic is about to happen tomorrow, but because the quiet transitions are the ones that shape decades. The dollar trap is not that your money disappears. It's that it stays exactly where it is while the world moves around it. Once you see that, you are no longer trapped. You are informed. And informed people still have choices.